Hi everyone, April here. This bonus episode was originally released on Patreon only and is part 2 to the bonus episode, episode 11, that I shared with all of you back in July. So if you haven't heard part 1, you might want to go back and listen to that one before you listen to this one. Hope you enjoy. Thank you for joining me for part 2 of, I guess you could say, how the West was penalized. Part 1 focused on San Quentin, so today it's all about Folsom. As they say in the real estate business, location, location, location. The state was going to certainly learn from one thing about the San Quentin fiasco, and that was to make sure the new prison's location was ideal. Have an abundance of construction material, in this case granite, which also happened to be close to a railroad and wouldn't result in costly reimbursement invoices from county sheriffs. It was also away from open bays rimmed with getaway boats. Either Folsom or Rockland fit the bill, but Folsom won out, in part because the American River that ran down to Sacramento would serve two purposes: a continual supply of water and act as a natural barrier. The surrounding landscape wasn't hospitable toward potential escapees either. A wild and desolate landscape of uneven hills, crags, and stunted timber. We left off in about 1861 when San Quentin had won its independence, so to speak, from a couple of greedy capitalists, and now was in the hands of the state, although greedy capitalism could still apply. Back up to 1858, and San Quentin was feeling the pinch. Too many inmates and not enough resources to go around. The legislature heeded the call and approved $250,000 for land and construction of a new prison. But as it often happens, differing opinions halted any real progress for the next 10 years. Plus, San Quentin was certainly a costly endeavor. The delay essentially came down to two opposing viewpoints: either expand San Quentin by adding a reformatory or build a branch prison. This very polarizing issue pinned Sacramento and San Francisco against each other, because at the heart of it was prison labor and which city would benefit most from it. Because San Francisco supplied San Quentin with coal, flour, beef, water, clothing, etc., expanding the prison using free prison labor would fatten the city's economy and cost less than the proposed new prison. Not so fast, said those in Sacramento. The granite available in both Rockland and Folsom was plentiful, which was very convenient because Sacramento also needed new sidewalks. The old wooden ones weren't holding up anymore, so proponents of the new prison said it would actually save the state money. The proposed site also had water, perfect for raising livestock and growing food, all ways in which the prison could be self-sustaining. Furthermore, the Natoma Water and Mining Company had made a very tempting offer. They would deed 350 acres for a prison site in exchange for prisoner labor in constructing a dam and canal on the American River. This would then power the operation of a sawmill. All the state needed to do was pay the company $15,000 in prison labor. This was about 50 cents a day per inmate. A pretty good deal then. The other major differing of opinion centered around prison reform and philosophies about the purpose of prison. Lock them up or reform them. It typically came down to age of the prisoners. The younger inmates were called reclaimables, and those, quote, confirmed in crime were generally older and had served more than one term, but also anyone who committed a violent or serious offense, even just one, was considered irredeemable. But just how were prisoners reformed? At the time, the New York or Auburn system, named after Auburn Prison in New York, was a modification from the Pennsylvania system, derived from Quakers that emphasized solitary confinement, total separation from others, most especially other prisoners. It was also referred to as the separate system. It was believed that silence bred penitence and reformation, a nice long time out to think about what they've done. The Auburn system saw great value in work. Idleness was seen as the kiss of death for an inmate's chance at redemption, but it also advocated for silence and separation as well, because both systems believed criminal habits were learned behaviors and could be reinforced when mingling with other criminals. For the Auburn system, because hard work was seen as a vital component in rehabilitation, it would have been impossible to be silent during the day, so it pushed for complete separation and silence at night and during other non-work interactions. Both systems, of course, believed in corporal punishment, but those who favored the Auburn way appeared to utilize hard labor and solitary confinement as punishment. And this was what was being pushed by those favoring a new prison, focusing mainly on hard labor, with very little to any thought toward separation of inmate type. Those on Team San Quentin leaned more toward reformation through separation, yet work was still valued as a criminality buster. What else was there? Work was seen as the only form of character building. Hard work, knowing the value of $1. Well, not if you were a prisoner then. You were not paid. And due to inadequate accommodations, overcrowding wouldn't allow for inmates to have their own cells. I came across an 1877 to 1879 biennial report of the Board of Prison Directors to the state governor. The Lieutenant Governor, James A. Johnson, not to be confused with James A. Johnston, warden of Folsom in 1913 and later San Quentin, was the warden of San Quentin at this time. He was also a member of the prison board of directors. And he said, "Were I asked to suggest the very best plan for the prevention of crime, I would advise the closing of drinking houses and the absolute solitude of prisoners." He acknowledged the alcohol part would never fly in this country, but did believe complete solitude could be achieved if prison population was reduced through education, kind treatment, and the influences of, quote, honest and moral people from within and from without. He said, "We should consider no man wholly and entirely bad, even though he be a convict, and that every man has within him a germ of goodness, which is capable of illimitable expansion." He encouraged the trustee system, incentive program like good credits. He wanted to see more pardons and said about life sentences, "This I believe to be wrong, for to anyone should be left grounds for hope that they may someday be free." He told the governor, "A little conditional clemency by the executive would lighten up the gloomy hearts of those wretched men with a hope that would at least drive out despair. This must," he said, "be done to make anything of them other than brooding, plotting, unreliable, unsafe, treacherous, and unhappy criminals." At the time, there were about 70 prisoners under the age of 18. 7 were 15 and 2 were 14. He said, "They nearly all tell the same tale of misery, want, intemperance, parental neglect, and cruelty. Idleness in almost every case has proved the downfall of these boys, nor has this resulted from their own choice, but because employment could not be obtained." This he did blame on immigrants, specifically the Chinese. Less whiskey and more work would have saved nearly all of these boys. While he did have some progressive ideas, he had some antiquated ones, still believed in corporal punishment and forced labor, but he was better than most wardens of the day. It might have taken around 155 years or so, but in 2023, San Quentin State Prison became San Quentin Rehabilitation Center, with an emphasis on rehabilitation and education. After 10 years, June 1868, the only thing really accomplished in way of a new prison was that Governor Henry Huntley Haight said, "Enough, we're picking Folsom." That didn't mean the end of the battle. It would continue for another 10 years. In that time, additional buildings were constructed at San Quentin because prison population certainly wasn't slowing down. In 1874, contractor Michael Miles was awarded the contract to begin construction at Folsom, but disputes arose over the next year between Miles and the Board of Prison Directors overseeing the construction. The board members based in San Francisco weren't keen on building the new prison and seemed to make things difficult for Miles. They favored keeping the money where they lived, not letting Sacramento and Folsom, that sleepy little podunk of a town, get a hold of a large chunk of free labor. Miles claimed that the board forced him into defaulting on the contract by not paying him, so he paused construction, but not before trying to remedy things himself. Only receiving 80% of the allotted sum, Miles took out loans from 2 banks, and well, these banks evidently failed, and he had to mortgage his own home in order to pay his men. He basically went bankrupt. Then the same thing happened with the next contractor in 1878 to 1879, who didn't have the best reputation to begin with, but was later deemed faultless by the chairman of the Joint State Prison Committee. It became clear that the board's tactic to sabotage the contractors meant they could tweak the plans, which they did both times. It's said that Governor William Irwin traveled to the prison on October 17th, 1878, and performed the official dedication of the site for the future prison by turning a few shovels of dirt. I couldn't find one article on this, which was strange because every visit before and after this date for him to inspect the progress had been reported on, but this one was not. A year later, an impressive cell building was nearing completion. The foundation of this Gothic-style building ran 17 feet deep, and the walls, of solid granite, were 8 feet thick on the base, tapering up to 4 feet, then 2 feet. It not only consisted of nearly 400 cells, but contained the guards' quarters. 324 cells in 2 tiers were completed. 36 more to go, were 8 by 6 by 7 and 1 inch, and sealed off with a solid iron door with only a 7-inch slot for ventilation and observation. Within the first year, due to suffocating heat, 14 ventilation holes about the size of a $50 were drilled along the top of the doors, and a small circular vent was installed in the back of the cell. The cells were pitch black once the door was closed. The floors weren't done yet. Those would be done by prison labor. Once a cell block was done, the free labor could commence. And that couldn't happen soon enough. And when it did, the other cell block, several months later, was complete. The administration building connected to the cell building by a heavy iron grilled door. It had a makeshift dining room and kitchen in the basement. This was supposedly the idea of Thomas Pockman, appointed Folsom's first warden in July of 1880, because of the very ill-conceived plan at San Quentin, where prisoners marched outside from their cells to where they ate. This way, the men could walk from their cells to the dining facilities without ever stepping outside. It was makeshift because by now the board was breathing down Pockman's neck. San Quentin was busting at the seams at over 1,500 inmates, and they wanted to transfer as many as possible, and soon. The dining room didn't even have tables and chairs yet, and the inmates already there, the ones building the prison, had to stand up to eat. Pockman protested, saying they weren't ready. He didn't have a bathhouse done, a laundry, adequate storage for equipment, and many guards and employees were still living in wooden shanties and tents. Even a water supply to the cell blocks hadn't been completed, so a hasty and primitive water tank was installed for drinking and cleaning. Water from the river had to be hauled in daily. But the board was adamant, and within a week, Pockman had selected his 6 guards and 14 civilians. Oh, and these guards needed to be trained in a matter of days. Their sole qualification was that they had to be excellent rifle shots. Why? Well, notice how I never mentioned the construction of walls. That's right, no walls. You would have thought that'd be a priority after the San Quentin experience. On the northwest side, the river was considered a natural border, and around the prison, in a semicircle fashion, were guard posts, initially rock platforms manned by expert marksmen outfitted with rifles. Pockman came up with what he affectionately called deadlines, boundary lines drawn on the ground in lime. You cross it, you will be fired upon. No warning shot. Those, he said, were time-consuming, wasteful, and unnecessary. Shoot first, ask questions later. It was said that this system proved so successful, the money allocated for the walls was directed toward other projects. Well, it was successful until it wasn't, specifically in 1903, but it would take another 43 years before the prison was finally encased in granite. It'd be a year before a guard tower was built, this one called Number 13 Tower. It was also an armory, packed full of rifles, revolvers, shotguns, a Gatling machine gun, a 6-pound howitzer, and a Lowell battery gun. Additionally, it contained 4 solitary confinement cells. The low hiring standards would show to be detrimental because most of these guards were heavy drinkers and thus unreliable. Within the first year, Pockman had to fire most of them. Now, 7 months earlier, in December, when the first cell block was completed, a Sacramento Bee reporter visited the site. He was in awe of the substantial and impressive cell blocks. Then he wrote, "It is urged by many that the new prison should be conducted on the principle of a reformatory institution, and that only those who have committed lighter offenses or who have erred for the first time should be contained therein." On July 26, 1880, Folsom was officially open for business, and 44 of San Quentin's worst arrived. There was much argument over who would be named Folsom's first inmate, until finally the guards and the new arrivals agreed it would be a Chinese man named Chong Hing. Warden Pockman hired 8 more guards, and it was a good thing because these initial prisoners had barely settled in when the prison directors sent down another 50 from San Quentin, then 100. These early months were rough, mostly for the prisoners. Imagine living in a hotel, still under construction. The cement floors weren't done for another year. I'm not even sure what they were made of. It could be really cold or really hot. Had terrible ventilation, no plumbing, and just candles for light. Gas lamps eventually. Security was a priority, not comfort or well-being. Each man was given 2 buckets, one for water, for drinking and cleaning, and the other for a toilet. Now that ventilation problem, well, use of the second bucket was discouraged unless in a dire emergency. And considering the food, which I'll get to, there had to have been a lot of emergencies. Even after the first sewer system came along a year later, waste was still released into the American River. And it seemed the sewer system was always a sore subject, having never been adequate, until about 1918, when a sewage disposal plant was installed. and the men had to get really good about knowing where their buckets were kept because of the lack of light. When the iron door closed, it was pitch black. They were each given a candle, and it didn't take them long to learn to calculate, to a fraction of an inch, how economical they had to be about it. It had to last them a month. Down the road, they'd be issued lamps with a specified amount of oil or kerosene. These doubled as a heater, a weak one, but it could put out a little bit of heat. Again, their usage had to be carefully rationed. A visiting reporter in 1880 wrote, "God help the criminals doomed to confinement in those cells. They will never see any other light but that which a flickering candle produces." According to Michael Brown, who I mentioned in part 1, who wrote the history of Folsom in 1978, when the prisoners were locked up for the night, the men were sloughed up, an old Folsom expression. The bunk bed mattresses were stuffed with straw, as were the pillows, then topped off with a coarse blanket. A year later, everyone would find out the hard way that wooden bunks were not the way to go because little vermin had nestled themselves inside the wood, so iron bunks had to be brought in. So now imagine your hotel room, made to accommodate just 2 people, was actually being used to house 4. But it could have been worse, believe it or not. The solitary cells were no picnic, unless you were happy to be away from your roommates. There was no furniture in these cells, only a mattress brought in at night. During the day, a good 12 hours, the occupant had to sit or lay on the floor, which might have been cement or dirt. Any ventilation holes, if there were any, were covered up in the solitary ward, so complete darkness and isolation. So that brings up punishment. The goal of solitary confinement was to make a prisoner as miserable as possible, not necessarily to give him the time and space to be contemplative, as the Pennsylvania system intended. For days, weeks, months, perhaps even years, one could be housed in a completely dark cell that had no furniture during the day and a cement or dirt floor. Those in solitary lived on a bread and water diet, interrupted every 3rd day with beans, bread, and sweetened tea. Men who spent extended periods of time in these cells sustained irreparable damage to their eyesight. This was something Abe Majors, from episode 9, complained of. He had spent well over 500 consecutive days in solitary. But Jacob Oppenheimer, you've heard me talk about him before. He spent about 18 years in these dungeons, and his eyesight was fairly damaged from living in near darkness for much of his incarceration. Now there were the derricks, hanging prisoners by their wrists, the straitjacket, and chloride lime cells. I talk about these in a bonus episode, the one on Charles Aull. Guards were also given the use of wooden staffs, clubs, and lead-tipped canes. Often their fists were sanctioned weapons. Hard labor was generally touted as rehabilitative, but labor conditions said otherwise. They were harsh, toiling away in either the blistering heat or the damp chill for hours upon hours without enough food, water, or adequate breaks. This caused many serious injuries and lots of deaths. They were at the mercy of guards, and when the state depended on this free labor, their bottom line was more important than the welfare of the workers. This work did not build character, but rather resentment. Prisoners often attempted to protest the inhumane conditions. The press, with the help of prison officials, labeled these events as revolts, dangerous and violent ones, of course, when in fact many did not entail violence or threats. Both histories of San Quentin and Folsom are littered with stories of prisoners who spoke up, simply wanting to be treated fairly and humanely, but were punished instead. As you might recall from part 1, providing prisoners with adequate clothing seemed to be a struggle, and even under Warden Pockman it seemed to be a difficult task to accomplish. But they were able to supply the men with pants that had barber pole stripes on them, and these were required to wear. But the men could wear their own hats, coats, vests, shirts, and shoes. Those with a history of escapes or were considered dangerous had to wear a red shirt, which branded one particular inmate as Richard Redshirt Gordon. He'll come up in a couple of upcoming stories. The men had to make these articles last, too, because it could have been all they had. And remember, a laundry hadn't been built by the time the prisoners arrived. At first, guards had to take them to the river at periodic intervals to both bathe and wash their clothes. Then Warden Pockman ordered a group of Chinese to set up a laundry on the banks of the river to do the wash, both of the inmates and the guards. Oh, and the food, the primary source of complaint. There was usually plenty of it, but there was little to no variety. Beans, beans, and more beans. They didn't have electric ovens or gas ranges, so everything was boiled or steamed in large vats on wood-burning ovens. The men were fed 3 meals a day and could count on at least 2 staples: boiled pork and some type of bean. Breakfast consisted of a grain cereal with blackstrap molasses, boiled pork, white beans, and coffee. Lunch was, beans, rice, bread, and sweetened tea. And then dinner, yes, boiled pork, potatoes, gravy, tea, and bean soup. If possible, beef or mutton was substituted for the pork, which I'm sure felt like a nice respite. The bread, however, was the only food item that didn't garner much complaints. Later on, when the dairy farm, cattle ranch, and fruit and vegetable gardens started producing, the food improved, but that was several years away. The men weren't forgotten, I guess, on special days such as 4th of July, Thanksgiving, and Christmas, when they got to enjoy some variety. It was either roasted lamb or chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, cheese, mince pie, apricots, coffee, and sugar. Now we come to healthcare. The first resident doctor came in 1881. His name was A.C. Glover. According to many prisoner reports over the years, the prison doctors weren't necessarily considered any nicer than the guards. They could be just as cruel. Although Dr. Proctor W. Day, who came in 1926 and stayed for 31 years, was more respected by the inmates. Perhaps not surprising, no medical records were kept for the first 37 years of the prison. A great number of inmates died during those years. Construction accidents that included the dam and canal in the quarry, and from diseases and other health-related illnesses that didn't have a cure then. The board was quite happy with Thomas Pockman and had hoped he'd stay on, but due to ill health, he tendered his resignation in November of 1881. So his $95,000 yearly salary and state-paid accommodations went to John McComb for the next 6 years. One really good decision by the Board of Prison Directors was to contract with the Folsom Water and Power Company in March of 1882 to build an electricity powerhouse. Once the dam and canal could be finished, the hydroelectric power would generate light at the prison and power machines, hoists, winches, and pumps. This electricity thing was fairly new. The first electric company in California came in 1879. And in 1882, Los Angeles was the first city in the U.S. to switch their streetlights from gas to electric. This was state-of-the-art stuff, and the board felt they were taking a pretty big gamble, but if successful, it could pay off. And of course, it did. It could have been earlier, but as usual, disputes arose. And like all other times, it was over prison labor between the power company and the board. So work stopped, and the board filed suit, which dragged on for 6 long years. By that time, the prison population had doubled from about 300 to over 600, causing a water shortage that had to be addressed. And while the powerhouse was completed in 1891, it wasn't operational until 1893 when the dam and canal were finally done. Hydropower was a game changer for the prison and for the town of Folsom. In January of 1894, Folsom established its first industry, an ice plant. Ice would be sold to the public, even though in the town of Folsom the demand wasn't incredibly high, yet it soon would be. The prison's first blocks, weighing between 850 and 900 pounds, were delivered to different businesses in town and said to be of excellent quality, compact and crystal clear. The Folsom Telegraph described this modern technology. The machine by which the ice is made consists of an upright compressing engine, a pump, a condenser, and 4 tanks, each of which has a capacity of 3 3/4 tons. It takes 86 hours to complete the operation of freezing. Demand grew, of course, especially among saloon and restaurant owners, and Folsom made about 50 cents per ton. Other industries would come and go at Folsom, most notably the selling of granite in the late 1890s. The quarry ceased operations in 1944, and a few years later, a license plate factory was built and a metal fabrication plant. So that is kind of a condensed version of Folsom's origin story. It's awfully difficult to distill all of Folsom's history into one episode, which is why I'll share much more as I go along. If you haven't already, please check out the bonus episode about Charles Aull, Folsom's 3rd warden, and his method of controlling prisoners. So thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it so much. Falling Through the Trap is written and produced by me, April Moore. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and follow the show on Instagram at Falling Through the Trap. I'll post photos and other documents on the show page, apriljmoore.substack.com, where you'll also find links to YouTube and to Patreon, where I provide bonus material, including bonus episodes. I'll release 1 to 2 new episodes each month, always on Fridays, where you'll learn the story of the next man to fall through the trap at Folsom Prison.